The bear wrapped its jaws around Carol's shoulder, and it lifted its massive claw and ended up scraping it along her shoulder blade, exposing the bone and ripping her Denali North Face jacket into pieces. Blood and cusps of the jacket filled its yellow claws as it raked and raked more into her shoulder. Her husband, Timothy, saw this happening from only about 10 feet away, and she moaned in pain and agony as this trauma continued. Fortunately for her, her husband was only 10 feet away, and he clubbed the bear over the head with a massive 4-inch thick stick. But it was at this point where the bear stood up on its hind legs and faced him, using its massive claw and swatting the 6'8" man to the ground. Somehow, Timothy found himself on his feet again, with the same stick in his hands, facing toward the bear. But the bear was coming at him with its massive skull and its jaws wide open, and Timothy rammed the stick right into its mouth. The bear swaying its skull from side to side with spit and saliva oozing from its jaws. Tim had no idea what he could do in this moment, and it was then that the bear snapped the 4-inch stick in half, the two pieces of it just falling along the wayside. And it was in that moment that Tim knew he and his wife both were surely dead. What's up, guys? Iceman here. So this story takes place in Denali, Alaska, in the beautiful mountainous ranges, the vistas, the valleys, the berries everywhere. What a beautiful place, and I hope to visit there someday. But before I get into it, I would like to thank you guys for all your support on this channel. And if you will, paw that like button, subscribe to the page, and swat the bell so you're notified next time I post a video. So Carol and Timothy were a newly wedded couple. They were only married for about a year, and unfortunately their marriage was already on the rocks. Timothy worked a construction job. He was a very strong and physically able man, but he worked long, hard hours and would often come home stressed and worn out. Whereas Carol worked at the local hardware store. She had to put up with a lot of crap from customers and from her boss. So basically, Timothy and Carol would wake up in the morning, get themselves ready for work. She would do her hair, her makeup, he would put on his work clothes, and they'd be off their separate ways, only to return home later exhausted and worn out and stressed. And that was apparently the time for them to socialize and get along and be husband and wife. And at that point, of course, the man just wants to relax and watch TV, and the woman just wants to take off all of her makeup, put on her clown pants pajamas, and eat pasta in bed. And she probably doesn't want to make dinner for anyone. So how really were they supposed to be getting along in the first place? And is this the setup that was arranged by nature or by God? Let me know in the comments below. But nonetheless, the two needed a break from life. But they didn't want to have a break from each other because they wanted the marriage to work. And they knew that if they didn't do anything, it was just going to continue to fall apart. So they decided to embark on just a small trip out, not too far from where they lived in Alaska, to the Denali National Park. So they drove down the roads, and it was a beautiful sightseeing adventure. The beautiful vistas and valleys and spruce trees and pines just everywhere, so much nature. And then they made their way to the park entrance. It seemed a bit crowded. There were just too many people there. So they went down another 30 or 50 miles down the highway to a more secluded region that was still connected to this national park. So they ended up getting out of their car. Now, this whole trip was only planned to be maybe a day long, or two at the most. So they did bring a tent and a cooler and a few drinks and snacks, but that was pretty much it. Unfortunately, they didn't bring anything that could deter a bear. No pepper spray, no hand cannon, nothing of that sort. But nonetheless, they continued on with their day adventure. So they parked their car in a cute little nook in the forest, right near a trailhead leading to a trail that apparently, according to the signs, led to a little place called Troublesome Creek. Now, Troublesome Creek was a place that was known to have frequent grizzly bears. In fact, during the summer months, it was closed to tourism. People weren't even allowed to go there because there were so many bears. The natural setup in the region allowed for an abundance of berries and salmon, so the grizzly bears would congregate there to fish for salmon all day until about the later part of September, which is when those restrictions were lifted, and is when Timothy and Carol went on this small trip. So basically, they started walking down this little dirt path, and looking around them, it was just beautiful. There were these tall spruce trees all over the place, and the leaves were all changing color. In the maples and oak trees, they could hear the birds and little squirrels chirping. It really made for a nice evening. And as they continued to walk down this path, Carol and Timothy began talking of a potential future vacation, because what they were on right now was just a little day trip. It wasn't anything serious. So they talked about potentially going to Australia, or maybe going over to Japan and enjoying themselves there. Perhaps there would be where happiness could be found. Perhaps there they will realize that they truly are soulmates. So at this point, they were really enjoying themselves. Now, while they were walking down the trail, they started to realize to the right, the little troublesome creek. Granted, they didn't quite realize at this time how much trouble this creek would cause them, so in the moment, it was quite a beautiful sight. So they walked along the trail, and then they saw on their side of the river, or creek, or whatever you want to call it, a beautiful sow grizzly bear, but a very, very big one nonetheless, along with 2 cubs. Now, Timothy and Carol, both being long-term residents of Alaska, knew that the sight of bears could potentially be dangerous if you don't deal with them properly. So they knew to keep their distance. But the concerning part was, of course, this mother sow had a couple cubs with her. So they started to veer off the trail just a little bit to try and avoid the mother sow and the 2 cubs. But what was really unusual is right after they took that turn, they looked over their shoulders, and right on the other side of Troublesome Creek, they saw another bear, what seemed to be a large sow, along with what potentially was either another adult grizzly or a juvenile. Maybe it was an older cub, but it was just unclear. It was a mid-sized grizzly bear along with a giant mother grizzly bear. And it was at this point that Carol and Timothy both knew that they had to get the hell out of there. So basically, Timothy and Carol began walking as fast as they could back to where they parked the car. They walked hastily through the brush, and they could hear something closing in behind them, something really heavy, as if it were like a truck or something. But they knew it wasn't a truck. They knew exactly what it was. They knew it was one of these massive sow grizzly bears. So Tim let Carol get in front of him, and it was at that point that they began to run. But he made sure to stay behind Carol as they were heading back to the vehicle. And Tim could hear that thumping and thumping and thumping getting closer and closer. And then he turned and he looked over his shoulder, and he could see the bear only about 12 feet behind him. And it was closing in on him, with its head swaying from side to side, as if it were either trying to intimidate him, or if it was a sort of signal that it was about to attack. But nonetheless, Tim turned back to Carol and began running as fast as he could. And he shouted to her, "Carol, keep running!" And it was at that point where the bear collided with him, and they found themselves both on the ground. And the bear started crawling up his body, just raking its claws into his flesh. Now, Timothy was wearing a brand new North Face jacket, and it had a really thick material to it. It was one of those tundra jackets. So he tried to turn his back to the bear as it continued to rake her claws into him, and the jacket took most of the brunt. But the thing is, while Tim was laying there still, Carol was still running. And she knew at that point there was a decision to make. She could either keep going and leave her husband there for death, or she could turn around and do something about it. Now, apparently, Carol didn't even think about it, but somehow she found herself with a massive stick in hand, and she charged at the bear and jammed the stick into the side of its head while it was on top of her husband. And of course, this caused this giant mother sow of a grizzly to give out a sort of bellow, and it growled and roared, and it swayed its massive head toward Carol, and it lunged at her, knocking the poor woman to the ground, and her stick just went flying out of sight. So the bear was then on top of Carol, and it began lunging at her with its massive skull, and it even ripped part of her ear off, which later required like 70 stitches or something like that. And it just kept mauling her and just snapping at her upper body, at the shoulder blade, and even toward her neck. This is when Timothy realized that he had to do whatever it takes to save his wife. He said that he felt a sort of emboldened anger about him, as if this animal was trying to take something from him, which I guess could be argued that it was. So Timothy, being the tall-statured man that he is, got up on his feet, grabbed the stick that went flying out of Carol's hands, and charged the bear again. And he lifted the stick up over his head, and he came down on the bear's head just like a sledgehammer. But unfortunately, the bear hardly noticed this in terms of it being an attack. The stick cracked over its head, and then the bear simply turned and stood up on its hind legs and knocked Tim over with one swipe right across his chest. So this, of course, caused Tim once again to fall to the ground. And then the bear simply returned back to Carol and continued to maul her. Tim, at this point, prayed to God that they could get through this. He prayed for strength and the ability to fight off this bear. And he could hear his wife moaning and screaming from the attack, only about 5 or 10 feet away from him. He could catch some glimpses of her body as the mother bear was on top of her, just shifting its weight all around, trying to get to a vulnerable spot on the woman. And she, of course, was trying to shield her head and neck, but the bear just kept ripping into her arm, and you could even see a lot of her bone exposed after the attack. So this is when Tim stood up again, and he grabbed the other half of the stick, which was still about 4 feet in length and about 3 to 4 inches thick. And before he pursued the bear again, he knew deep within his mind and heart and body and soul that he had to keep his feet on the ground. He couldn't let the bear swat him down again, because every time the bear would swat him down, it would return to attacking his wife. So he knew that similarly to a boxer, he had to somehow stay on his feet while fighting this animal. Otherwise, his wife was going to die. So he methodically approached it, and like a baseball bat, he swung upward into the bear's snout. And this caused the creature to react in a way for the first time as though it was negatively affected by the impact of the stick. And it snarled and got off the wife again and turned to Timothy, swiping at him again with its right paw. But Timothy, aware of this, backed away as soon as the bear was about to swing, so it actually missed him by only a few inches. And the moment the bear missed him, he stabbed the bear in the face with the massive stick, like it was a spear or something. And then this is the situation that I talked about in the beginning of the video, where the bear started coming at him with its mouth wide open, and he held the stick horizontally, and the bear chopped down into it. And he was able to fend the bear for just but a moment. But then, of course, the stick snapped in half and Timothy was left vulnerable again. But the crazy part is, while all this was happening, there was that other bear right across the river watching this hideous scene take place. The bear was standing on its hind legs with its little paws up like this, just kind of watching this whole scene take place. And Timothy took notice to this bear. It was only like 15 feet away from them, and he knew in his mind that if this second bear were to come in and join this attack, that he and his wife would most certainly be dead. But nonetheless, after the bear broke the stick in half, it jumped on top of Timothy, and he thought at that moment he was going to die. The bear was just tearing into his body. He was trying to protect it with his arms, but the bear just kept brushing his arms away and swatting him in the chest, face, and neck with its paws. But then the bear heard Carol moan, who was about 20 feet away still and on the ground. And of course, this caused the bear to get up off of Timothy and head right toward Carol again. But it got about halfway between Timothy and Carol, and it just kind of stood there for a moment, almost as though it was considering evacuating the scene. It was breathing really heavily at this point, just panting and panting. And Timothy was still on the ground, taking notice to this. He was getting ready to get back up to fight the bear all over again. But then the bear started walking toward his wife again. And this is right when Timothy got back up to his feet and yelled at the bear. The bear then turned around and charged after Timothy, only stopping about 4 or 5 feet in front of him, just staring at him in the eyes, panting and panting, and then looking back at Carol, his wife, and looking over at the bear across the river, and then back to Timothy, and just panting and panting. And then, miraculously, the bear turned and walked away. It was almost as if the bear knew it was going to continue getting attacked if it continued attacking Timothy and his wife. And even though it could easily kill them both, it probably didn't really consider that endeavor to be worthwhile, because humans, of course, aren't generally prey for bears. So the bear just kind of walked off into the brush, with the other bear right across the creek, standing there watching the whole scene. But nonetheless, Timothy and his wife made it back to the road, but they were far away from where they parked, so they started trying to hitchhike back to their car. A few people swerved off and avoided them, but one nice lady apparently picked them up and brought them back to their vehicle. So from there, Timothy drove both of them to the hospital to receive treatment. And apparently, this couple made it through the attack relatively unscathed. Carol had all sorts of issues with her shoulder for years, but after a long time of physical therapy, she ended up regaining full functionality to her right arm, whereas Timothy just had scars all over his face and body and neck. But they went on, continuing their marriage, and even had children after this attack. And both of them agreed that this attack brought them closer to each other. This whole struggle to survive, this situation that they found themselves in, it made them stronger as a couple. But jeez, what a freaking horrendous bear attack. I can't help but wonder if maybe if you live out in Alaska, you just get kind of used to the bears being all over the place, which might have led this couple to go out there one day without much protection at all. And it seems like if Timothy didn't continue attacking the bear when it was attacking his wife, she certainly would have been dead. And his attacking it might have been what caused the bear ultimately to flee the scene. But what an act of bravery as well for Carol to take initiative on that when the bear first attacked her husband, and she was in that moment where she knew she could either run or go back and fight. What a decision that must have been to make. But I'm curious, what would you guys do if you were in a similar situation with your spouse? Say that you were the wife in this situation. What if you saw a massive grizzly bear attacking your husband? It was on top of him, just tearing him to shreds. And you knew in your heart you could probably run and get away, and it would just keep attacking him until it killed him. And by that point, you might be back to the car. Or you could stay there and fight and potentially risk both of your lives, and maybe you would both just die. But what would you do in Carol's situation? Let me know in the comments below. And I appreciate you guys and gals for listening to this bear attack story. And if you will, like this video, subscribe to the page, and I'll talk to you all soon with more chilling tales from the Iceman.